Yesterday we had, in my work, we had our annual Christmas meeting. And the speaker who will be speaking here in a moment as our featured presenter. And the feedback was very good. Randall O'Toole is a fellow at the Cato Institute. He's also a fellow at the Independence Institute. He's an economist. He's a lecturer at universities, and he's speaking on the subject of government's planning and its impact on our quality of life. And so we're glad that he's here. If you haven't, get a cup of coffee, turn your chair this direction, but for the next 35-40 minutes or so, I think we'll be enlightened by Randall O'Toole. Let's give him an Elbert County welcome.
Well, thank you, Tom. As Tom said, I work for the Cato Institute, which I like to think of as the nation's leading think tank that believes in free markets and personal freedom and economic freedom and small government. And I can tell you that people at the Cato Institute are a lot more optimistic about our future today than they were a couple of months ago. And it's thanks to people like you that we have that optimism now. One of my fellows at the Cato Institute is a man named P.J. O'Rourke. And you may have heard of him. He writes for Rolling Stone magazine and he used to write for National Lampoon. He says, Democrats believe government works. Republicans believe government doesn't work. And then they get elected and prove it. So we're counting on you to make sure the Republicans who got elected don't prove that government doesn't work. Now at the Cato Institute, I'm known as the in-house rail nut. I love trains. I helped restore the steam locomotive, which is owned by the city of Portland. By the way, I live in Oregon. I don't live in Washington, D.C. Most Cato people are in Washington, D.C., but I'm from Oregon. This steam locomotive is the second most powerful operating steam locomotive in the United States, and I helped restore it and run it, and I actually bought 5 passenger cars to run with it. I'm also a cycling nut. I do things like ride around Crater Lake, which is 33 miles around and 4,000 feet of hill climbing. I'll do it 3 times in one day, which is about like riding up Pikes Peak Highway twice in one day. That's just for fun. So you'd think as a rail nut and a bicycling nut that I might like some of the ideas that are coming out of the Obama administration. But even though I love trains and I love bicycling, I hate subsidies more. And I look at what's happening with Obama's transportation plans, and basically he wants to reform the United States into what he thinks Europe is like, and do that using transportation rules that every city in America is going to have to follow. Leading the charge is our Secretary of Immobility, Ray LaHood. Now, Ray LaHood was a Republican congressman from Illinois, but his name is very apt because he's been acting like a hood, giving money to people who agrees with him and yanking money away from people who disagree with him. He just took a $1.5 billion away from Ohio and Wisconsin because they elected governors that he didn't like. Now the governor said they didn't want, the governor-elects said that they didn't want the money, but instead of just yanking it away, he could have waited until they made it official. They haven't even taken office yet. Anyway, Ray LaHood has said that it's his goal to coerce Americans out of their cars. How's he going to do that? He's written a strategic plan that calls for transforming America. They love the word transform because it sounds like transportation and it means change. And of course, Obama was for change, whatever that means. There's 3 ways they want to transform America. First, they want to build high-speed trains all over the country. Second, they want to have all the cities that are on the high-speed rail network build light rail or streetcars. And third, they want to pack most Americans into high-density developments in those cities. Some people call this, what do they call it, rural cleansing, where they thin out the populations of the rural areas and pack people into the cities. It's hard to believe that they're actually thinking in those terms, and yet you look at the numbers and that actually seems to be what they're doing. The problem is, none of these policies are going to even achieve the evil goals that they have. They're not going to succeed in doing anything that they want to do. All they're going to do is drag the economy down because they're going to cost us a lot of money. We can look at high-speed trains in Japan. If you've been to Japan and Europe and ridden the high-speed trains, you might say, oh, these are successful. It's too bad we don't have some here. The problem is, they weren't successful in transforming Japan or Europe. And in fact, they are fairly insignificant except for as a burden on the taxpayers. Look at Japan. They built the world's first high-speed train in 1964. At the time, only 10% of all passenger travel in Japan was by car. Almost 90% was by train. So they built this high-speed train, and what happens? The car zooms up, and today 60% of all travel is by car, and only 25% is by train. The average resident of Japan rides the high-speed trains less than 400 miles a year. They drive 10 times as much as they take the train. They fly more than they take the train. Domestically, within Japan, they fly more than they take the high-speed trains. They take low-speed trains 3 times as much as they take high-speed trains. The high-speed trains are insignificant in Japan except for as a burden on the taxpayers. They spent $300 billion building high-speed trains, and then they sold them to the private sector for 1/2 cent on the dollar. France is building high-speed trains too. France has spent more money per capita building high-speed trains than we spent on the interstate highway system. And all of that came out of tax dollars. The interstate highway system was paid for out of user fees. Yet the average resident of France rides high-speed trains less than 400 miles a year. They drive 20 times as much as they take high-speed trains. They take the bus more than they take high-speed trains. And they fly 3 times as much as they take high-speed trains. Again, domestic travel within Europe, not travel to the United States or other places like that. So high-speed trains are an insignificant part of the French economy except for the fact that it's a huge burden on the taxpayers. Now when you look at the history of transportation, there have been technological developments that have had transformative effects on our economy. The original trains, steam trains in the 1830s and 1840s. The electric streetcar that was developed in the 1880s. The mass-produced automobile that Henry Ford started producing in 1913 that made cars affordable to everybody. And the interstate highway system that gave us places to go all over the country. These had huge transformative effects because each of these modes of transportation were faster, more convenient, and less expensive than the modes they replaced. So they didn't just replace other modes, they led to vast increases in mobility. The average American probably traveled less than 2,000 miles a year in 1810. Today they travel 20,000 miles a year, 10 times as much, because we have faster, cheaper, more convenient transportation. The interstate highway system allows people today to travel, the average American today travels 4,000 miles a year on interstate highways. And they ship 2,000 ton-miles of freight. The people who want to build high-speed trains promise that if you let them build high-speed trains all over America, the average American will ride them 67 miles a year. And they want to spend more money doing that out of your tax dollars than it costs to build the interstate highway system. That's not a transformative effect. California is proud. They want to spend $50 or $60 billion building high-speed trains, and they promise 98% of the people riding these trains will not be new travel. It'll be people who would have driven or flown instead of taking the train. Only 2% will be new travel. You don't get a transformative effect on your economy if you don't have new travel. All you're doing is shifting people from low-cost modes of travel to high-cost modes of travel. Really, high-speed trains are only going to be convenient for people who work and live downtown. And less than 8% of Americans work downtown, less than 1% live downtown. So not more than 90% of Americans are going to be spending a lot of money to help move the 8 or 9% of Americans who live and work downtown. And who lives and work downtown? It's going to be bankers, lawyers, bureaucrats, people who don't need your subsidies. But they're going to get them if we build these high-speed trains. Today, you can fly. Average airfares are 13 cents a passenger mile. The average cost of driving between cities is also about 13 or 14 cents a passenger mile. There are some subsidies to airports. I think we should get rid of them. There are some subsidies to highways. I think we should get rid of them. But those subsidies only add up to about a penny a passenger mile. Amtrak costs 60 cents a passenger mile. Half of it is a subsidy. High-speed trains are going to be $1 a passenger mile or more, and depending on what the fares are going to be, a large chunk of that's going to be a subsidy. Amtrak charges 75 cents a passenger mile for its high-speed Acellas between New York and Washington, D.C. You want to take the high-speed train from New York to Washington, D.C.? $150. That's the fare. Or you can take a bus. $15. Which are you going to do? Who's going to ride the trains? Lobbyists, bureaucrats, who your tax dollars are paying their fare. Ordinary people don't take the high-speed train. They take the bus, which has free Wi-Fi and leather seats and is very comfortable. I've been on it. I wouldn't take the train if I had to pay for it myself. If somebody else pays, I might take it. The real problem with high-speed trains is it's just going to be totally politicized. We started out with a proposal put together by the Federal Railroad Administration for several high-speed corridors, like San Francisco, Los Angeles, Portland to Seattle, Houston to San Antonio. They didn't have a Houston to Dallas corridor because Southwest Airlines lobbied against it, but they had these other corridors. This is a map published by the Obama administration in February 2009. Well, you don't see Denver or Phoenix or Las Vegas or Salt Lake City on the map. So they all got together and they pooled their money and they hired a lobbyist to get added to the map. 1 year later, here's the new map. Notice we now have a high-speed rail route in the vital Cheyenne to El Paso corridor. And Las Vegas and Phoenix got on the map. Salt Lake City still isn't on the map. They must be real disappointed. But there's also a high-speed rail train and the plan from Minneapolis to Duluth. Why do they want to rent a train to Duluth? Well, maybe it's because the chairman of the House Transportation Committee was from Duluth. But he just lost the election, so maybe that route will get taken off the next map. The new chairman of the House Transportation Committee is from Orlando, and he was real excited about having an Orlando to Tampa high-speed train, but he can read the election returns, and he's now backing off on that, which is a good thing. Back in 2002, Florida wrote the environmental impact statement for their high-speed train from Tampa to Orlando. And they said, what is the environmentally preferred alternative? They compared a bunch of alternatives, and they said, the best alternative for the environment is don't build it. The environmental cost of building it is greater than any benefits you get from it. So, believe it or not, they actually decided not to build it. Is that smart or what? That was in 2002, and then President Obama comes along in 2009 and says, we'll pay for it. And Florida says, okay. And they took $3 billion from the federal government to build their high-speed train. Now, they just elected a new governor, and the federal government now says they want Florida to pay 20% of the cost, so there's still a chance we might be able to cancel the Florida train. As you probably know, Wisconsin and Ohio elected governors who said absolutely we're going to cancel those trains. And so I think there's a good chance we can stop the high-speed rail madness. If we don't stop it, it's ultimately going to cost taxpayers $1 trillion to have high-speed trains that only rich people are going to ride. Now then we have light rail. You know, Denver has light rail. I worked very hard to stop light rail from being passed in 2004, the Fast Tracks bill, but it passed, and now they find out it's going to cost 50% more than they promised it was going to cost, and the revenues aren't as great, so they're going to have another measure on the ballot next year to raise taxes even more to build more of the system. I'm going to tell you some stories about light rail from my hometown, which is Portland, Oregon. I don't live in Portland anymore, but I used to. I grew up there. They built a light rail line in 1986. I don't want to say nobody rides the light rail in Portland, but they had a train going from the airport to downtown, and it only had one passenger on board. Now, coyotes like to go where they know they can find solitude from people. Now, the truth is, people do ride the light rail in Portland, but in 1980, before they started building the light rail, Portland buses carried 9.8% of all Portland area commuters to work. 1990, they had opened up one light rail line. It was down to 7.5%. 2007, they had opened up 3 more light rail lines, and the streetcar line is down to 6.5%. That's the great success that is Portland's light rail. We have driven 1/3 of the transit riders off of transit into their cars. Why? Because light rail is so expensive that they had to cut back on bus service to pay for the light rail. And so unless you were lucky enough to be living on the light rail route and working on the light rail route, you can no longer take your bus to work, and so you now are driving. Between 2000 and 2007, they opened up 3 light rail lines and a streetcar line, and the number of people taking transit to work, not the percentage, but the number actually fell by about 1,000. And the number of cars on the road driving to work grew by more than the total number of transit riders. That's a success that is Portland's light rail. If you want more of that success in Denver, then vote, then get people to vote for that measure. I know you're not going to be voting on that, but tell your friends in Denver to vote for the measure that will get people out of transit and into their cars and increase congestion in Denver. Vote for it when it's on the ballot next November. Nationally, we've spent $500 billion subsidizing transit since 1970. Before 1970, Denver Transit, Portland Transit, most transit was private. And then about 1970, they were all taken over by the government. We've socialized it. We've spent $500 billion subsidizing it. You can see what's happened. Automobile travel, tripled. Transit, flat. We now spend vast amounts subsidizing transit. And who benefits? Transit workers. That's it. It's transit employees and rail contractors. It has nothing to do with moving people around. The cost of transit is the most expensive form of travel in the United States. Driving in urban travel is about 23 cents a passenger mile. Transit averages almost $1 a passenger mile. Light rail is the most expensive, almost $2 a passenger mile. Of course, they don't charge that. You can see the green shows the fares. The red is the subsidies that you have to pay even though you almost never ride it. Not only that, we're not taking good care of our transit systems. Our highway systems are actually in pretty good shape. The number of bridges that are considered structurally deficient has been steadily declining. The smoothness of pavement, believe it or not, has been steadily increasing. Because highways are paid for out of user fees, we maintain them and we take good care of them. Transit is funded out of tax dollars, and Congress loves to cut ribbons, so they don't love to sweep brooms. So they don't maintain it. This report from the Federal Transit Administration found that transit systems, mostly rail transit, have a $78 billion maintenance backlog. The head of the Federal Transit Administration, who was appointed to that job by President Obama, gave a speech last May in which he said, "Why are transit agencies coming to us and asking for money to build more rail transit when they can't afford to maintain what they've got?" He said, "Paint is cheaper than trains. Paint your buses a fancy color and tell them people it's a special bus, you'll get more riders than you will if you build an expensive train." And I thought he was being a little facetious, but then I read some numbers about Eugene, Oregon, which was once my hometown as well. Eugene built what they call a bus rapid transit line. They built a special bus lane, but it turned out they engineered it so poorly that it's no faster than riding the bus on the streets. So they spent all this money on a special bus lane. They painted the bus a fancy color. And they surveyed the bus riders, and they found out 80% of them think they're getting there faster because it's a fancier bus. And it isn't any faster. And they've increased ridership by 120%. no light rail line has increased ridership by 120%. So this was cheap and it was successful, and you don't see Denver and Phoenix and other cities doing this. They want to get as much money as they can out of the taxpayers, not provide better transportation. People think transit is good because it's good for the environment, saves energy, reduces pollution. Well, that was true 40 years ago when cars were gas hogs and transit vehicles were mostly private and were pretty well filled up. Today, we have much more energy efficient cars. You can see the energy efficiency of cars has gone way up, or the energy consumption has gone down, whereas transit has gotten less energy efficient because it's become publicly owned, and we have these big tax districts, so we send buses and trains out to suburbs that have 3 cars in every garage and nobody rides transit, but they're taxpayers, so we have to send them a bus. So we end up having empty buses. The average light rail car that Denver has can hold 150 people and has an average of 14 people on board. The average bus can hold 60 people, has an average of 11 people on board. If you drive an SUV that has 5 seats and you're the only one in that SUV, you can pat yourself on the back because your SUV has a higher occupancy rate than the average Denver bus or light rail. And cars are getting more fuel efficient all the time. By 2025, cars will be absolutely the greenest form of travel. They'll be more energy efficient and less polluting than even the most efficient transit in America, which is New York City Transit. They're going to be far more energy efficient. And so people are going to be telling you, stop taking transit, get in your car, because that's how you're going to protect the environment. Today, urban transit buses are the most energy wasteful forms of transportation there is for surface transportation, land-based transportation in the United States. You can see they're more energy consumptive than light trucks, which include SUVs. Light rail is worse than cars. Intercity buses, interestingly, are the most energy efficient land-based transportation. Urban buses, the most energy inefficient. Intercity buses, the most efficient. What's the difference? Simply that urban buses are public, intercity buses are private. The private buses go where people want to go, so they fill them up. The average urban intercity bus has 2/3 of its seats full. The average urban bus has 1/6 of its seats full. So, of course, you're going to get more energy efficiency. Now, the third plank of the Obama, what they call livability platform, is getting people out of their single-family homes and into high-density apartments. And it's all tied into rail transit. For example, here's the Portland Light Rail line. No, excuse me, that's not a Portland Light Rail line. That's actually in Moscow, Russia. Here's the Portland Light Rail train. Whenever I see a red-white light rail train in front of an ugly apartment building, I think it's Portland. But the difference is, you can tell, in Moscow it's sunny, and in Portland it's raining. In Portland, they built this light rail line in 1986, and they zoned everything along the line for high-density development, high-density residential mixed-use development, so people could walk downstairs from their apartments and condos and go shopping. 10 years later, this is what they got. Absolutely nothing. No new development. And so, they did what planners everywhere do. When they don't get what they want, they start subsidizing it. Since then, they've offered $2 billion in subsidies to developers along the light rail lines if they'll build high-density developments. Because they want to pack people into these dense developments. The mayor of Portland has said he wants all new residents of Portland for the next 50 years to live in a high-density development. He doesn't want to see a single-family home built in Portland ever again. Here's a typical development. Oh, excuse me, that's not one of Portland's high-density developments. Here's the one in Portland. This one is in the former East Germany. It was built in the Soviet era. The difference is, when I took this picture, this was scheduled to be demolished because as soon as the East Germans got their freedom, they all moved out into single-family homes. But now that Portlanders and Denver and Boulderites and people in other cities have lost their freedom to live in single-family homes because the urban planners have made housing so expensive, we see people moving into places like this. Now this is supposed to be a transit-oriented development. There's the light rail station right behind this building. You can see there's some cars parked there. They only provided 2/3 of a parking space per housing unit. But you see those cars? You see that little red sign? That sign says no parking, fire lane. You see these cars? See that red stripe? That's the sidewalk. They're parking on the fire lanes, they're parking in the sidewalks because the managers know that if they enforce the parking rules, that everybody move out. Because it's not a transit-oriented development, it's an automobile-oriented development. And the fact that there's a light rail station next door doesn't mean anything. Here's another one. This is supposed to be a mixed-use development. 3 stories of apartments on top. Ground floor is supposed to be shop, so you can walk downstairs and get your morning cup of coffee or get your hair done or whatever. The only problem is every single shop is for lease because they didn't provide any parking for the shops. There's a big parking lot. There's a park and ride station for the light rail, but you can't park and shop. And so nobody's going to have a shop there. Now, this doesn't mean that light rail is always bad for business. Portland's Max light rail line turns out to be really good for some businesses, but they just aren't businesses that you necessarily want to have in your neighborhood. Now, what happens when you draw an urban growth boundary around a city to try to get people to live in higher densities instead of spread out in what they derisively call sprawl and what we call the American dream? What happens is it makes housing real expensive. This is a house that's sold in Houston at the top of the housing bubble it's a 4-bedroom, 2.5 bath, 2,300 square foot home, sold for $155,000. That was at the peak of the bubble. If you wanted that house in Denver, it'd be easily, at the peak of the bubble, $380,000. Today it might be $320,000. If you wanted it in Boulder, $640,000. If you wanted it in San Jose, about $1.4 million. Now in San Jose it's come down to about $1 million because of the bubble crashing. But not only did smart growth or livability or urban growth boundaries or whatever you want to call it, not only did it make housing more expensive, it made our housing markets more susceptible to bubbles. So we know we had this huge housing bubble that collapsed that led to this international financial crisis. But the only places in America that had bubbles were places that had urban planners drawing urban growth boundaries. Places like Los Angeles and Fort Lauderdale and Denver and Portland. If you didn't have urban planners drawing urban growth boundaries, you didn't have bubbles. This is Atlanta, Houston, Dallas, same chart. Prices didn't go up, prices didn't go down. Prices, you can buy a house today in Houston, it'll cost you maybe 0.5% less than at the peak of the housing boom. Because urban planners didn't destroy the housing market like they did elsewhere. Now, only about a dozen states had urban planners destroying the housing market, and it caused an international financial crisis. Secretary of Mobility LaHood has issued directives that all urban areas in the United States, when they write their next transportation plans, have to incorporate housing plans that will force people to live in higher densities so that the next financial crisis will affect all housing in the country instead of just in those dozen states. Won't that be wonderful? California has already gone through 3 housing bubbles because they started doing this kind of planning back in the 1960s. Florida only started doing it in the 1980s, and so they've only been through 1 housing bubble. What should we do instead? What should we be doing to promote mobility, to promote the American dream, instead of fighting it by trying to get people out of houses, trying to get people out of their cars? Well, one really simple, cost-effective thing to reduce traffic congestion, save energy, and reduce air pollution is coordinating traffic signals. The Federal Highway Administration says that only 1 out of 4 traffic signals in America are properly coordinated. It's not sexy, it's not obvious, like building a big train, expensive train somewhere, but it's very effective. It only costs about $25,000 an intersection. You can save lots and lots of save the people who use those intersections lots and lots of money, so it pays itself back socially very quickly. Now we have transit systems all over the country. It's one of our biggest socialized systems. We need to privatize it. We need to unsocialize our transit. And then we'll get better transit for a far lower cost, and I think everybody will be better off if we get rid of the transit systems that are encouraging cities to go for the high-cost transit programs like light rail instead of efficient bus transit. Now those are short-term solutions. In the next 10 years, we're going to see something entirely different, something that will transform our economy, something that will have a huge impact, and that is driverless cars. Now this sounds like science fiction. We've been hearing about driverless cars for 70 years now. You know, the flying car, we hear about that. Well, I'm here to tell you, the flying car isn't going to happen anytime soon. But driverless cars are there. We've got the technology. The only barriers today are institutional and bureaucratic. It's because our highways are all government-owned, and the government is doing nothing to support them. Back in 1997, the state of California, using some federal Department of Transportation money, did a test. They built a new freeway, and before they opened the freeway, they ran some driverless cars. They had 8 cars running 65 miles an hour, 1 car length apart, perfectly safe, nobody in these cars. If one of the cars is going faster than the others, they could switch lanes and pass and without any problem at all. And the assistant director of the department, assistant secretary of the Department of Transportation, came and witnessed this demonstration, and he said, "That's great, I'm canceling the program." His previous job had been as director of the nation's largest transit agency. And I think he could see the driverless cars were going to put transit out of business, and so he didn't want to have anything to do with them. Since then, the only government money for driverless cars has come from the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. They offered a $2 million prize to anybody who could design a driverless car that would go through a certain obstacle course in the desert. They wanted driverless cars for the same reason why they want pilotless airplanes, so they can have vehicles during war where you don't risk anybody. And the winner of that prize was an entry put together by Volkswagen and Stanford University. And then 2 years later, in 2007, they had another challenge for an urban environment. You had to be able to take your driverless car through an urban environment with stop signs and stoplights and pedestrians and other cars and not violate any traffic laws and not have any accidents, be able to park in parking spaces and so on and so forth. The Volkswagen Stanford entry won second place. They won $1 million. The first place prize, $1 million, is won by Carnegie Mellon and General Motors. At that time, the vice president of research for General Motors said, "You'll be able to buy a driverless car by 2018. The only obstacles are institutional and bureaucratic." Now you can see this car has all kinds of sensors on it to detect things. Volkswagen has been doing a lot of research since then. They've now got all the sensors down to little teeny laser beams that are around the car. And these laser beams detect everything that's around them, and they also use GPS. And they say that GPS, with enhanced GPS technology, they can locate a car to within 2 centimeters of wherever they want it to be. So here's a Volkswagen. They call this their valet parking car. The way this works is you drive up to a restaurant, you get out of your car, and you say to your car, "Go park." And it goes and it drives around until it finds a parking place. And then it parks in that parking place by itself. And then when you get done at the restaurant, you get out, you pull out your iPhone, you say, "Car, come." And the car will start the ignition and come and pick you up. And then you can go where you're going. And you don't necessarily have to drive anymore after that. And Volkswagen they planned to do this in September, but they had an accident that caused them to delay it. But they planned to run a driverless car at racing speeds up the Pikes Peak Highway. They were hoping to beat the fastest human. The fastest human ever driving up the Pikes Peak Highway went an average of 65 miles an hour. They were hoping to beat that, and unfortunately they had a helicopter accident. They had hired a helicopter to monitor them, and the helicopter crashed. And did somebody die in that accident? I think a couple of people seriously injured or something. Anyway, so they postponed that. They plan to do that next summer. Now, driverless cars are going to have enormous benefits. We'll be able to triple the capacity of our roads. Congestion will be a thing of the past. But mobility will be universal. You won't have to be 16 years old and have a driver's license to have a driverless car. You can be 90 years old, you can be blind, you can be paraplegic, whatever. All you have to do is be able to tell the car some way where you want to go. Take me to grandma's house, take me to work, whatever. It'll do it. It'll be faster, it'll be safer, and it'll be far more energy efficient than cars we have today. Now here's a car you can buy today. This one happens to be a Honda, and this is in England, but you can buy cars like this in the United States from Toyota, Mercedes, all kinds of different manufacturers. The car has, first of all, what's called adaptive cruise control. It measures the distance to the car in front of you and maintains a fixed distance. So there's never any risk that you're going to get hit. You're going to hit the car in front of you. It also has something called lane keep. It watches the stripes on the road and steers between the stripes. So you don't have to have your hands on the wheel. It also has collision avoidance. It has sensors all around it so that if a car starts to pull into your lane, it will veer, it will brake, it will accelerate, whatever it needs to do to avoid getting hit. And that's 90% of a driverless car right there. And you can buy a Toyota Prius that has all of those things on it. Costs about $30,000. Most of that cost is just in the Prius cost. It won't be long before you could take a car and add $250 of options to it and have a totally driverless car. Now the Obama administration has its heart set on building for America the world's finest 1930s era transportation network, complete with 110-mile-an-hour trains that average 50 miles an hour, complete with streetcars and what they call light rail, but really it's just a slightly advanced streetcar. We need to look to the future, not to the past. That means we need to look to personal transportation, not to collective transportation. I talk about all of these issues in detail in my new book, which just came out this year, published by the Cato Institute, Gridlock, Why We're Stuck in Traffic and What to Do About It. My previous book is called The Best Laid Plans, and both of these books are over here for about $20 each. Their list price is $25, but we don't want to make change, so some people $20. Actually, the books are free, but my autograph is $20. If we run out of books, we're running low on one of them. If we run out of books, just give me your address and I'll ship one to you and send you an invoice. I also have a lot of papers on the web that you can download for free. You go to cato.org. And I have a blog called The Anti-Planner. Just Google Anti-Planner and I'm the first thing on the list. Finally, I have an email list that I send out to once a month. No more than once a month. You get an email from me to get updates on what's happening with transportation policy and what the people you just elected to Congress are going to do. If you want to get on that list, give me your email address and I'll be glad to put you on. Do we have time for a couple questions?
Yeah. Yes.
Yes?
What is your feeling about the Department of Transportation? Should it be canceled?
The Federal Department of Transportation. The question is, what should we do with the Department of Transportation? I assume you mean the Federal Department of Transportation. Should we abolish it? And really, there are a few things that the federal government does, like interstate commerce and international commerce, that might be appropriate for the federal government to continue to do, but 90% of what the Department of Transportation does is really local and state. And so I do think we should abolish the Department of Transportation and take those few things that are international and interstate in scope and put them in the Department of Commerce like they used to be. And really, we built the interstate highway system. That's great. It's a wonderful system. But we don't need federal handouts to maintain that system. The states can do that. One bill that's been proposed by Jeff Flake of Arizona and Scott Garrett of New Jersey is to allow the states to opt out. Allow the states to raise their gas taxes, and the federal gas tax is 18 cents. And so for every penny they'll raise theirs, the federal will be reduced by that much, so it won't cost taxpayers anything. But that way, the states will get to control how to spend the money instead of having the federal government playing with it, earmarking it, and doing all kinds of other things with it. Yes?
How much money does it take to change the existing railway beds to high speed?
Well, there's really two kinds of high-speed rail. I didn't get into this, but one high-speed rail is you take the existing railway beds that are providing freight train service, and you upgrade those beds, and it costs about $5 to $10 million per mile to do that. You upgrade them so that you can run high-speed trains, but you can't run them any faster than 110 miles an hour. And in fact, Burlington Northern Santa Fe, CSX, and CSX have both said, we don't want trains running any faster than 90 miles an hour with our freight trains. Norfolk Southern has said, we don't want any trains running faster than 79 miles an hour with our freight trains. Union Pacific is the only major railroad that said they're willing to have 110 mile an hour trains coexist with their freight trains. If you want anything faster than 110, you have to build brand new from scratch. That costs minimum $30 million a mile on the flat, $100 million a mile in the mountains. And you're never going to get a single cent of that back. Fares are not going to even cover the cost to operate those trains, so you're never going to get any of the capital cost back. Whereas essentially all of your state highways are paid for out of your gas taxes and tolls. Only local roads are paid for out of other taxes. And we ought to be able to pay for those roads out of tolls or user fees as well. Yes?
Don't you have the same problem that you discussed earlier, that they don't go where people want to go?
Well, that's really part of the problem with collective transportation, is that you have to be able to find a place where thousands of people want to go every day. And you look at New York to Boston, or New York to Washington, D.C., which are the densest corridors we have in America, and Amtrak has 6% of the travel market. You know, after spending billions of dollars and plus annual operating subsidies, it has 6% of the travel market. That's the best we could do anywhere. Most places it's going to be like 1% or 0.5%, if that. Yes?
Talk to us for a minute about the energy policy the United States has and how that contributes to these problems.
That's a pretty...
We're not going for oil, we're not doing the things we need to do to keep the cost of energy down to begin with.
That's a big issue. I'm not one to be really concerned about being dependent on foreign oil. The oil market is a world market. If we did a lot more drilling for oil in the United States, it wouldn't affect our gas prices all that much, because it's a world market, there's a world demand, and the amount of additional oil we would bring by doing a lot more drilling in the United States today is not going to be enough to influence it. It makes a lot more sense for us to hold on to that oil for a little while and wait till oil prices get up high and then start extracting it when we can really make some money from it. But here's the thing about oil. Is that the people tell you, the environmentalists tell you we're running out of oil and prices are going to go way up. But the reality is we're running out of Saudi Arabian liquid oil. It costs about $5 a barrel to get oil out of the sand in Saudi Arabia. So it's cheap oil. But Alberta, Canada, has lots and lots of what's called tar sand oil. It's thicker oil. It costs more to get out, $40 a barrel to get out. But oil prices right now are more than $40 a barrel. And guess what? Alberta has more tar sand oil than Saudi Arabia has liquid oil. And when people talk about we're running out of oil, they never count the tar sand oil. Colorado has more shale oil than Alberta has tar sand oil. But it costs $100 a barrel to get out of the ground. So we're not going to do it until oil gets to be permanently over $100 a barrel. Now, what are oil prices today? They're about $70 a barrel. So there's no point in worrying about getting that shale oil. And yeah, there's oil off on the coast, you know, the Gulf Coast, the California coast, that we could get to be cheaper. But still, we're hanging on to this shale oil. We're hanging on to some of the other oil. We'll have that oil 100 years from now. And 100 years from now, oil prices will still be not much more than $100 a barrel, which means in terms of gasoline, it's about $3.50 a gallon instead of $3 a gallon. not a big difference. Because most of the cost of your gasoline is not the barrel of oil, it's getting it to you. And the change in the barrel doesn't change that. So I'm not really worried about oil right now. What I'm worried about is a sensible financial policy for transportation. I hope that doesn't disappoint you.
Randall, thank you.
Thank you very much.